Hello. In this video is step 4 in activity 2. We are going to kind of wrap things up at a couple of final features so that we get this nice minimal viable product that we can bring back to our client to get some more feedback. And the 3 features I'm going to add is I'm going to add a little bit more robust error checking. I'm going to add a really simple high contrast mode. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll give us an idea. And I'm going to add an option where whenever the user calculates a valid volume, it actually saves the information to a file that I can then go and look at later. So let's do that. So the first thing I do is I'm going to take step 3, I'm going to copy all of step 3, and I'm going to paste it into step 4. I'm going to save this, let's clear that up, and I should get the exact same program. There it is. And if I put in 1, 2, and I hit calculate, I get my nice value. But if I put in a string, and I hit calculate, you'll notice 2 things. The display is obviously wrong, and then I get this error in the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a structure called a try except structure. And this is a structure that can be used to kind of stop a program from crashing and do something specific that you want it to do. And so what I'm going to tell it to do is that if someone puts in the word cat, or in fact any string for radius or height, I'm going to set them to -1. Because, if I put in a string here, remember, I can't cast it to a float. Alright, let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to come back into my program, and this is the line where the casting's happening. That's where the problem is. And what I do is I use this thing called a try, and I tab it in, and then I put this except structure. And the way this works is anything inside the try structure, if something goes wrong, it doesn't run the standard error, it actually jumps down to the except and runs a piece of code. And essentially what I said is that if the user enters something like a word, I want to set the radius to -1. And so now I can do that. So if I save this now, I run this program again, you'll notice if I put a word in here like monkey and I put height 5 and I hit calculate, it doesn't crash. I get an incorrect output, but it doesn't crash. So now let's make that same correction to height, and let's deal with this output. So if I come and find where am I casting height to a float, which is right there, so I'm going to try, tab, I'm going to accept, and I'm going to say h equals -1. So let's save this. So where is the problem coming that we're getting this bad output? Well, it's coming from right here. Because what happens is when I set height or radius to -1, we invoke the calc volume cylinder function, so it comes up here, and then it returns -1. Remember when we were writing this earlier, we said -1 is a reserved kind of number that is sent back to indicate there's an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify our output down here to basically behave differently if it gets a -1. So I'm going to take this output, which is right here. So that's the output that I currently use. And I only want to do this output if volume is not equal to -1. So what happens now is it only does this if volume is not equal to -1. So if I save this and I run this and I put in something like cat, dog, and I calculate, nothing happens because the volume's been calculated as -1, which tells the program there's an error. But if I put in 4, 3 and I hit calculate, it works fine. Now watch what happens if I put in something like yo-yo, yo-yo, and whatever, and 0. It doesn't crash down here, but the problem I have is the display is actually incorrect, because notice it gives me that, which is not correct at all. So what we're going to do now is we're going to come back to here, and we're going to say else, and we're going to copy this entire output display. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it, and I'm just going to get rid of the result, and I'm going to print something like bad input. Now this is something where, this is okay, probably what you want to do is give the user some more specific feedback about what the bad input is. So if we save this, give this a whirl, I put in something like cat and 6, and I hit calculate, I get bad input. I put 1 and 3, and I hit calculate, and it works fine. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to get this high contrast button working. And essentially, when I click high contrast, what I want it to do is to change, I want it to invert the background and foreground colors. Now again, I'm not going to make this work perfectly because that will take a while, but I'm going to get it working good enough so that you get the idea and you can kind of start playing with this. So the first thing we have to understand is that with check buttons, I can bind a function to them, and then I can basically run that function whenever that button is selected. But what we do is we actually associate a special type of variable with this check button beforehand. So if I come down here, and here's my check button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a special type of variable I'm going to call var, and I'm going to say tk.intvar. You might say, well, what is this? Well, what this is an integer variable that can be bound to a check button. And when you do this, essentially the program will automatically switch this variable from 0 or 1 respectively. So what I have to do now is I have to do two things. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to create this function and associate this variable with this check button. So I'm going to put comma and I'm going to say var, or variable, equals var. And so what I've done now is I've made an association between this variable and this check variable. So in other words, anytime I select that button, it's going to influence this var here. The second thing I'm going to do, let's give a little more space here, is I'm going to bind a function to this. So I'm going to make a command, and it's going to be called check select. And check select is going to be a function I'm going to write that is invoked anytime that button is clicked. So it works the same way as when we bound this button with this command run me, but the event here is the changing of that check mark. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to, with all my functions, I'm going to make a def, and I'm going to call it check select. And let's just print for now check select and make sure this works. Let's clear this. So here it is, and watch what happens when I click. So every time I click that, I turn it on and off, can't see it, it's running that function. Okay, so what happens if I do this? Print var. Let's see what happens to var every time I click that. So if I come down here and I click, so I get pyvar, which is this odd thing. Well, pyvar is what it says is var is a little bit more of a complicated variable. And to get the actual value, do var.get. So if I save this now, and I run this, and watch what happens every time I click it. It goes 1 on, 0 off, 1 on, 0 off. So it's switching state. And I can use this switch of state to decide if it's going to be high contrast mode or not high contrast mode. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an if statement here. So I'm going to say if, actually before I do that, I'm going to delete all these print statements just to keep it clean. And I'm going to make a variable called state. And I'm going to say var.get. So I'm going to get the variable state. And I'm going to say if state is equivalent to 1, print, and we're going to say high contrast. Else, and I'm going to print low contrast. So let's save this and let's just see what happens here. So I'm going to kill this, and this. I'm going to drag down here and watch down here at the bottom of the screen. Ready? High contrast, low contrast, high contrast, low contrast. Beautiful. Let's clear this up. Okay, so how do I do this? Well, I simply set the background and foreground colors. So I'm going to go radius label, because that's the label with the radius, and I'm going to configure it. So config, and what I do is I set the foreground equal to white, and I set the background equal to black. So because when we're in a high contrast state, the foreground is white and the background is black. And so if I save this and I run this, notice when I check the box, watch radius up there. There it is. But there's a problem. When I check it back, it doesn't go back. Because what I have to do is I have to take this, and I now have to invert that back. So we're going to take this, and we're going to take the radius label again, and we're going to set the foreground to black, and the background to white. So let's save this. Let's give it a run. And now we get this nice high contrast mode. Well, sometimes if I double click, it changes. Okay, now I'm just going to basically highlight a bunch of code that I've pre-written and paste it in the interest of time. So all I've done is I've taken the radius label, the height label, the radius entry, and the height entry, and the output, and I've set it to foreground white, background black. And when state is not 1, I change them all to black and white. So let's save this, and let's see what happens. So ready? Oh, high contrast mode, low contrast mode. High contrast mode, and look, when I type in there, it's all white. And let's put something there, and bad input. Let's put something valid, 3 and 4, and I hit calculate. And then let's turn it off, and let's see what happens. Beautiful. And so now I have the starts of a contrast mode that I can share with my client and get some feedback on. Okay, I'm going to pause this video here, and I'm going to continue with a part 2, where I'll do the last thing, which is save the information to a file.